In the summer of 1945, as dawn broke across the city of Hiroshima, life appeared deceptively ordinary. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters. Children prepared for school. Fishermen hauled in their morning catch from the waters of the Seto Inland Sea. Housewives hurried through narrow alleys, carrying baskets of rice and vegetables. The rhythm of daily life was steady, even though whispers of war echoed everywhere. Japan was exhausted. Cities had been bombed. Food was scarce. And yet, beneath the weight of despair, people clung stubbornly to fragments of normality. No one knew their world was minutes away from vanishing forever. At precisely 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, the Enola Gay, a silver B-29 bomber, released a single object from its belly. It drifted silently through the air, a weapon unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. The bomb detonated at an altitude of nearly 2,000 feet above the city center. In less than a second, a flash of light brighter than the sun ripped across the sky. The air itself ignited. Shadows seared into stone. Buildings dissolved into firestorms. Tens of thousands of lives ended in a single heartbeat. And yet, amid the carnage, a haunting mystery remained. The imprints of vanished people burned into the surfaces where they once stood or sat a day. They came to be known as the Shadow People. These outlines, etched into stone stairs, bridge railings, and walls, told a story unlike any eyewitness could describe. Human beings, reduced to nothing but a shadow. The images shocked survivors. They horrified occupying forces. And for decades, they raised questions that still haunt historians and scientists alike. Who were these people? What do their shadows reveal about that instant of annihilation? And why were their stories largely buried beneath official narratives? This is the untold history of Hiroshima's shadow people, the hidden victims whose silent testimonies remain carved in stone. To understand them, we must go back to that moment. When the atomic bomb detonated, temperatures at ground zero soared to an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Celsius. Heat so intense it could vaporize human tissue almost instantly. The blast produced a light of blinding intensity, casting sharp shadows of objects and people caught in its path. For those directly exposed, the searing light burned away their bodies, leaving behind only an absence, a silhouette etched into the surfaces behind them. On the steps of the Sumitomo Bank, a dark outline appeared where a man sat waiting for the doors to open. He was incinerated in an instant. His body never recovered. Only his shadow remained, fused into the stone like a permanent scar. Nearby, on the steps of a government building, another shadow was found, believed to belong to a woman or a child, frozen forever in the moment of their last breath. To those who witnessed these ghostly remnants, the shadows became symbols of both terror and remembrance. They were not just marks on stone. They were evidence of lives lived, lives erased, and a moment in time captured by forces beyond comprehension. But these shadows were not evenly distributed. Some surfaces bore no trace at all. Others carried only partial outlines, as though reality itself had glitched. Scientists later explained that these nuclear shadows formed only when something blocked the intense thermal radiation at the moment of detonation. The human body absorbed the blast, sparing the surface behind it from bleaching. When the body vanished in the heat, the shadow remained as a darker area, a chilling negative image of life erased. But beyond the physics, there is the human question. Who were they? The man on the steps of the bank, was he a clerk, a father, a stranger passing through? Did he have children waiting for him at home? Did someone search for him in the ruins, never knowing his final resting place had become an outline carved into stone? The shadow people are not simply scientific anomalies. They are the silenced witnesses of history. Survivors who walked the ruins in the days after spoke of the shadows with horror and reverence. For some, they were proof of divine punishment. For others, they were unbearable reminders of loved ones gone. A young woman named Michiko later recalled stumbling through the smoldering wreckage of Hiroshima, her skin blistered from burns. She remembered pausing by a wall where the faint outline of a human shape was visible. She could not tell if it was a man or woman, only that someone had been there. She said it felt as if the city itself was crying out, bearing silent witness to those who could no longer speak. American soldiers and officials who entered Hiroshima weeks later documented the phenomenon with photographs. The images circulated secretly among military circles, regarded as both scientific data and propaganda material. But many of these images never reached the public at the time. The shadows were considered too disturbing, too haunting, too incriminating. The United States, eager to frame the atomic bomb as a weapon of victory, had little interest in amplifying images that screamed of humans suffering beyond imagination. And so, the shadow people became a hidden history. Yet, for the survivors of Hiroshima, they could never be forgotten. In the years after the bombing, as the city rebuilt, debates raged about what to do with the remnants. Should they be preserved as monuments? Should they be removed, so the living could heal without staring daily at death's imprint? Some shadows were carefully cut from walls and steps, placed in museums as grim relics of the atomic age. Others were quietly destroyed, erased in the rush to modernize. But the memory of those who became shadows never vanished. To the Hibakusha, the survivors, these outlines were sacred. They were not stains. They were the last remains of family members, neighbors, strangers who never even had graves. For decades, many survivors struggled to speak about them. Trauma silenced them. Shame silenced them. Some feared discrimination, for Hibakusha were often stigmatized, seen as cursed, diseased, or unlucky. Yet their silence could not erase the shadows. They lingered in photographs, in memories, in whispered stories passed down to children and grandchildren. And so, the hidden victims endured. To this day, the term shadow people carries a haunting dual meaning. In one sense, they are literal shadows burned into stone. In another, they represent the forgotten, the countless victims of Hiroshima whose lives were reduced to statistics, their individual stories buried under the enormity of history. And so we ask again, who were they? What moments did they live before the bomb fell? What conversations did they have that morning, never knowing those words would be their last? The shadow on the Sumitomo bank steps, the shadow on the bridge railing, the shadow of someone seated by the post office. These are not faceless shapes. They are the final echoes of human lives. And in their silence lies a story we are only beginning to understand. Hiroshima's shadows are not just marks left by fire. They are moral questions carved into stone. They ask us, what does it mean to destroy not only life, but the very memory of life? What responsibility do we bear toward those who were erased so completely that only their outlines remain? And why do so few of us know their names, their stories, their truth? To uncover the answers, we must follow the trail of those who lived through the bombing, those who saw the shadows with their own eyes, and those who fought to preserve their memory against a world that wanted to look away. Because the story of the shadow people is not just about Hiroshima. It is about how history chooses its victims. Who is remembered? Who is forgotten? And who lingers as a ghost in plain sight? The ruins of Hiroshima did not fall silent after the bomb. They groaned. They burned. Survivors stumbled through what was once their city, blinded, wounded, delirious. Some called out for family. Others wandered in shock, unable to speak, their bodies charred beyond recognition. Amid this chaos, the shadows remained fixed. Still, unmoving. They could not scream. They could not plead. But they told their story in silence. Many survivors did not understand what they were seeing. Some believed the shadows were spirits, lingering imprints of souls torn from their bodies. Others whispered that they were warnings from the gods. Children, traumatized beyond words, later recalled being terrified of passing near those shapes, as though they might awaken and swallow them whole. The psychological weight of these shadows was immense. Even in a city where corpses filled the streets and rivers, the outlines haunted people in a different way. They were not just dead. They were erased. To see them was to see the moment of death, frozen forever. One of the most chilling testimonies came from a man named Shigeo. He had been just outside the city center when the bomb fell. In the days that followed, he ventured into the ruins in search of relatives. He remembered finding the outline of a person against a wall near the T-shaped Aioi Bridge. The figure was crouched, as if shielding itself. He stood before it for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe. He later said it was the moment he realized what had happened was not war. It was something beyond war, beyond human imagination. And he could never unsee it. For many survivors, the shadows became symbols of guilt. Why did they live while others were reduced to imprints? A woman named Keiko, who was 12 when the bomb fell, described years later how she avoided walking past the steps of the Sumitomo Bank. The shadow on those steps, she said, haunted her more than the corpses she saw that day. Because corpses could be buried, but a shadow, that could never be buried. It lingered, mocking the living with its silence. Meanwhile, American authorities documented these shadows with precision. Teams of scientists, photographers, and military officers studied the phenomenon. Reports described the physics, how thermal radiation burned surfaces, how bodies shielded stone, how outlines were preserved. But in the cold language of these reports, the human dimension vanished. The shadows were reduced to data points, evidence of the bomb's power. Nothing more. In the United States, newspapers carried triumphant headlines. Atomic bomb ends war. Photographs of mushroom clouds filled front pages. But the shadows of Hiroshima were hidden from the public eye. Images that leaked out were often dismissed as exaggerations or enemy propaganda. For years, Americans would not see the haunting outlines etched into stone. When they finally did, decades later, many recoiled in horror, realizing what had been concealed. This silence was no accident. After the bombing, American occupation authorities imposed strict censorship on Hiroshima. Journalists were forbidden from publishing uncensored images of the city's devastation. Survivors' testimonies were controlled. Even Japanese newspapers operated under watch. The shadow people, too disturbing to fit the narrative of victory, became casualties of censorship. They were seen, but not shown. Known, but not spoken of. Yet within Hiroshima, memory persisted. In small gatherings, survivors whispered of the shadows. Parents told their children. Teachers, quietly defying restrictions, spoke of them in classrooms. The shadows became part of a hidden oral history, passed down in fragments, like forbidden knowledge. When the American occupation ended in 1952, restrictions lifted. The first exhibitions of Hiroshima's devastation shocked the world. Visitors saw the photographs of burnt-out ruins, of disfigured survivors, of shadows etched into stone. The effect was profound. In Europe and America, many could not believe such images were real. Some dismissed them as trick photography. Others, confronted with undeniable evidence, began to question what it meant to unleash such a weapon. And yet, even as images spread, the individual stories of those who became shadows remained elusive. Who was the man on the Sumitomo Bank steps? Who was the figure on the bridge railing? Who crouched near the post office wall? Their names were lost. Their identities consumed in fire. They became known only as the shadow people. Anonymous, universal, eternal. But among the Hibakusha, there was another truth. People believed they recognized the shadows. A shopkeeper swore that the outline on the bank steps was a neighbor, a clerk who waited there every morning. A former soldier insisted one shadow belonged to his younger brother. These claims were never proven, but they reveal something important. The shadows were not just abstract images. They were personal. They were family. They were fragments of memory clinging to stone. In the decades that followed, Hiroshima rebuilt itself. Skyscrapers rose where ashes once lay. Streets filled with traffic. Neon signs lit up the night. Yet beneath the modern city, the shadows lingered in memory. Some were preserved in museums, carefully cut from stone. Tourists visited them, whispering in hushed voices as if standing before ghosts. Others were destroyed during reconstruction, sparking outrage among survivors. To destroy a shadow was to destroy the last trace of a life. Preservation efforts grew. In the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, visitors today can still see the haunting outline of the person on the bank steps. The stone itself, grey and pitted, carries the blackened imprint of a vanished human being. Standing before it, one feels both awe and sorrow, awe at the sheer, terrible power that could create such an image. Sorrow for the life erased, the story untold. Scientists, too, continued to study the phenomenon. They concluded that the shadows formed through a combination of intense thermal radiation and surface bleaching. The exposed areas of stone lightened under the blast, while the areas shielded by a body remained dark. Essentially, the shadows are not burn marks but preserved patches of original surface. This means the shadow people are not stains of death, but survivors of a kind. Survivors of surface, if not of flesh. And yet, science alone cannot explain the power of these images. Because what lingers is not just physics. It is the silence of those who left no other trace. The world came to know Hiroshima's devastation largely through survivors' testimonies. Writers like Ibuse Masuji, in his haunting novel Black Rain, captured the chaos and agony. Filmmakers documented the suffering. But the shadow people could not speak. They could not write. They could not testify. Their testimony is the absence itself. This is why they haunt us still. In art and literature, the shadow people became symbols. Poets wrote of them as ghosts trapped in stone. Painters depicted their outlines as bleeding wounds on the city's memory. Even musicians invoke them in haunting compositions. In every case, the message was the same. These shadows are not only marks of destruction. They are questions about what it means to erase human life so completely. And yet, as time passed, memory faded. For younger generations in Hiroshima, the shadows were less a living memory and more a museum exhibit. Something to visit on school trips, to write essays about, but not to feel as their grandparents had felt. Survivors, growing older, worried the meaning would be lost. Some began speaking publicly, giving interviews, writing memoirs, urging young people to remember. They knew the shadows could not speak for themselves. If memory faded, the shadow people would vanish a second time. Meanwhile, outside Japan, the shadows remained obscure. They were not part of mainstream history. School books rarely mentioned them. In the West, the atomic bomb was still often framed as a necessary act to end the war. The suffering of Hiroshima was acknowledged, but rarely in intimate detail. The shadows, too disturbing, too personal, too damning, stayed in the margins. This is why telling their stories matters. Because the shadows are not only Japanese history, they are human history. They remind us that behind every statistic, behind every military justification, there are individuals erased so completely that only an outline remains. Imagine sitting on a step, waiting for a bank to open. Imagine leaning on a railing, pausing for a breath of air. Imagine crouching by a wall, tying your shoe, or shielding your eyes from the morning sun. And then imagine your entire existence vanishing in a flash, leaving nothing but a silhouette in stone. This is the story of the shadow people. And it is a story that still challenges us today. Because even as we preserve their imprints in museums, the world continues to live under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Hiroshima's shadows are not relics of the past. They are warnings for the future. They whisper, this is what happens when humanity crosses the line between war and annihilation. This is what it looks like when life itself is burned into silence. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: the shadow people did not choose to be remembered. They did not ask to become symbols. They were ordinary men, women, and children, living ordinary moments on an ordinary morning. Their only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, because of that, they became witnesses for all humanity. They remind us of the fragility of life, of the cost of weapons that erase not only bodies but identities, and of the moral responsibility to remember those who cannot speak. As the decades pass, their outlines grow fainter. Stone weathers. Surfaces crumble. Photographs fade. But the story of the shadow people endures, carried by those who refuse to let them be forgotten. Their silence speaks across generations. Their shadows stretch across time. And if we listen, we can still hear them. Not with words, but with presence. A presence carved into the very stones of Hiroshima. The hidden victims. The untold witnesses. The people who became shadows. As Hiroshima rose from the ashes, its people carried invisible burdens. The hibakusha, the survivors, lived with radiation sickness, disfigurement, and trauma. Many were ostracized, denied jobs, feared as carriers of disease. Their scars were visible, their suffering undeniable. Yet the shadows, those who left no flesh, no bones, no graves, were even harder to speak of. How do you grieve for someone who left behind no body, only a mark on a wall? Families struggled with this. Some visited the sites of shadows as though they were graves. Mothers laid flowers at the steps of the bank. Widows bowed before the railing where a silhouette remained. Children, who never found their parents' remains, whispered to the outlines as if they were listening. In this way, the shadows became shrines. Shrines of absence. Shrines of silence. And yet, they were also reminders of an unspeakable cruelty, that in Hiroshima, even memory itself could be burned away. In the 1960s and 70s, as the world entered the nuclear age with ever more powerful bombs, Hiroshima's shadows gained new meaning. Anti-nuclear activists invoke them as symbols of the inhumanity of these weapons. Posters showed the imprints. Speeches invoked the people who became shadows. Their silence became a rallying cry, never again. But still, the details of their lives remain hidden. Who they were, what their names were, how they lived before that moment. These questions remained unanswered, like locked doors in history. It is here that the story takes its most haunting turn, because the shadows are not only a record of destruction, they are also a mirror held up to us. They show us how easily a life can vanish, how fragile our existence is, how thin the line is between being remembered and being forgotten. And they ask, if this happened to us, who would remember our names? Would we, too, be reduced to outlines? Consider this. In Hiroshima, nearly 140,000 people died by the end of 1945. Yet only a fraction are remembered individually. Most remain as numbers. And within that vast loss, the shadow people stand apart, because they are neither living nor fully gone. They are imprints, between existence and absence. They force us to confront the unthinkable, that memory itself can be annihilated. Survivors often spoke of this. They said the shadows were worse than corpses, because they were erasures. To look at them was to look at nothing and everything at once. One survivor, Yoshiro, said, "A body, at least, tells you someone lived. A shadow tells you they were erased." This is why the shadows remain so disturbing. They are not only relics of Hiroshima, they are warnings about the fragility of history itself. In the decades after the war, Hiroshima became a city of peace. Monuments rose. The Peace Memorial Park became a gathering place for remembrance. Each year, on August 6th, thousands gathered to release lanterns into the river, carrying prayers for the dead. Speeches echo with the words "never again." And yet, even in these ceremonies, the shadow people rarely receive direct mention. They linger at the edges, silent witnesses, waiting to be seen. In the museum, visitors pause before the preserved shadows. Some weep, others stare in stunned silence. Children, too young to understand, ask their parents, "Who is this person?" And the parents cannot answer, because no one knows. In this way, the shadows demand humility. They remind us of the limits of memory, of the incompleteness of history. They remind us that even with all our technology, our archives, our monuments, some lives will always slip through the cracks, remembered only as absence. But perhaps that is their power, because in their anonymity, they speak for all. The man on the bank steps could be any man. The child on the wall could be any child. They are every victim of every war, every life erased by violence, every person forgotten by history. And so, their silence becomes universal. Their absence becomes presence. They are not just Hiroshima shadows. They are humanity's shadows. Today, scientists still study the remnants. Conservators struggle to preserve them, as stone weathers and fades. Some shadows have already been lost forever, destroyed by time and neglect. Others survive only in photographs. The race against forgetting continues. But whether preserved in stone or in memory, their meaning endures. Because the shadows ask us to choose whether we will remember them or let them vanish again, to choose whether we will see them as relics of the past or as warnings for the future. And this choice is not only about Hiroshima, it is about us. In a world where nuclear weapons still exist, where nations still rattle sabers, where the threat of annihilation has not disappeared, the shadows remind us what is at stake. Not only life, but memory. Not only bodies, but the very traces of existence. The shadow people stand as the most fragile of memorials. Not statues, not inscriptions, but absences. And in those absences lies the greatest testimony of all, that war does not only kill, it erases, it annihilates. It reduces human beings to silence so complete that only their outline remains. And so, as we stand today, decades later, we must ask, what do we owe them? Do we owe them names? Do we owe them stories? Do we owe them remembrance? Perhaps the answer is all of these. But above all, we owe them recognition. To see them not as curiosities of physics, but as people. To see in those outlines the lives that once were. To acknowledge that in their silence, they still speak. In this sense, the shadows are not gone. They live in every retelling, in every visitor who stands before the stone, in every child who asks, "Who is this person?" in every whisper of never again. And so we end where we began. In Hiroshima, on an ordinary morning, a man sits on the steps of a bank. A woman leans against a wall. A child waits by a railing. Ordinary lives, ordinary moments, and then a flash, a silence, an outline, the hidden victims, the untold stories, the shadow people. Their testimony is not in words, but in absence, not in sound, but in silence, not in life, but in shadow. And if we choose to remember them, not as statistics, not as curiosities, but as human beings, then their shadows will never truly vanish. They will remain, etched not only in stone, but in us. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory they can have. For in a world that tried to erase them, they remain. Still, silent, watching, shadows that refuse to fade.